All right. Well, welcome to Magic in the Ordinary. Today it is my joy and privilege to welcome a former Hollywood animation studio artist who now has her very own company. And I'm thrilled to have her on the show. Welcome, Rachel.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yay! I wanted to jump right in and just could you share a little bit about your experience in Hollywood animation studios? Kind of what was that journey like?
Yeah, of course. I grew up in Colorado. There's obviously not a lot of animation industry stuff out there. I was always an artistic kid. I was always drawing and writing. And in high school, I came to realize that animation was kind of the perfect combination of those two passions because it's art telling a story. So I ended up moving out to California to go to Loyola Marymount, which has, I think it's like the number seven animation school in the country or something like that. But it was also Catholic, which was appealing to me. And My first experience in like the actual industry was as an intern at a studio called 6 Point Harness. It's kind of a smaller studio that does a lot of work for the bigger studios. I worked as a production intern there, so I got a lot of experience with kind of the technical day-to-day scheduling and stuff like that. And then later, I was a production intern at Cartoon Network, kind of the same deal. A lot of the managing the artists, managing the schedule. Of course, as an intern, you do a lot of the like little things like I carved the pumpkin for the Halloween party for the crew, which was fun. Um, and then After I graduated, the animation industry is very competitive. It's kind of a feast or famine dynamic. And so it was hard for me to first get my foothold in, even with those internships under my belt. I spent about, I think, 9 or 10 months working at Subway, a pizza restaurant, and Macy's. And then finally, I got a previous student at LMU who was currently working in the industry to look at my portfolio. I had really admired her because of her senior thesis film, and she forwarded me to the recruiting manager at Warner Brothers, and I ended up getting my first like real job as a storyboard revisionist on Wacky Races. But as you asked about my experience in the industry, first of all, very feast or famine. If there's jobs, there's jobs. If there's no jobs, there's no jobs. But also, you kind of always have to be on your feet. So this job that I had worked about 10 months to get, the very next month, AT&T buys Warner Brothers and AT&T cancels 4 shows at once. So my first job lasted about 6 weeks. So in the entertainment industry, especially if you're a contractor and you're not like built into the structure of the studio as an employee, you kind of always have to be looking for a job, which can be stressful, and is definitely something to consider if you want to get into the industry. Thankfully, I was able to land on my feet, and after that, for about 5 years, I had a pretty consistent set of gigs at Bento Box, Warner Brothers, and then some freelance at Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network here and there. And I would say that your experience at a particular show is very much dependent on the production staff and kind of their style, as well as the directors. I've certainly had some experiences, and I won't name names, but there were certain people who ran the shows in not a very fun way and made it very stressful. You're lucky if you can get a good producer and director who respects your time as an artist. Yeah, so I guess that's kind of a general overview both of my career and my feelings on everything in there.
That's fantastic. So I guess even if there's a job that's a little bit rougher, the since you have so many gigs lined up, the hope is that you move on to the next one fairly soon. Is that kind of how it was, or
Yeah, like for example, for me, I again won't name names, but there was a particular show that was very grueling, very high expectations, huge assignments, not a lot of time to get them done. And I just started looking for jobs because of how miserable the production was. And I was able to find a gig outside of my contract, sorry, before my contract ended. And I just, jumped ship 3 months in advance because, you're a contractor. You don't necessarily have like this oath of loyalty to the studios you're working at. And I'm not, again, feast or famine. So it's not like there's always those jobs to find. But it is good to kind of keep your contacts alive, and let people know you're looking if you are.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
You also mentioned that you studied at Loyola Marymount University. What were some things that I guess, what were some big takeaways from there? What are some things you've learned there?
I think probably the most important thing that I learned at LMU was how to use Storyboard Pro, which is the industry standard storyboarding software, at least for television. I believe that feature tends to use Photoshop, but I've never worked on a feature film before, so I can't speak directly to that. In my junior year at Loyola Marymount, we took a class called intermediate storyboarding workshop with Jay Oliva, who is a storyboarder artist who worked on a lot of DC superhero films. This class had the reputation for being like the worst class in terms of it was just really difficult. And it was really difficult. There was a lot to do, a lot of homework.
Wow.
But I mean, he threw you in and you just had to get on your feet. And you learned a lot in that class, both about like the core rules of storyboarding, like the 180-degree rule, and just ideas about cinematography. And then you just had to learn the tools on Storyboard Pro, or you weren't going to finish your homework. So it was very useful to know how to use Storyboard Pro, like straight out of college, because a lot of storyboarding gigs require you to test beforehand. Like they'll send you a script and they'll be like, storyboard 2 pages of this script. So it was really good
Wow.
to be able to go into that already knowing how to use the software. I guess other than that, it was just, I don't know how much of this was just me naturally improving as an artist, because I think there's always some element of that. The more you create, the more you grow. But we did have to take studio art classes, like figure drawing and stuff like that.
Um,
And I think that the experience working in realism in addition to like cartoons was a really good um, experience in order to sort of flesh out my stylistic abilities and stuff like that.
that's amazing. If there are students or anyone listening who are interested in trying to get into animation, do you have any advice for them or yeah, any tips for how to get started?
So I have a couple of thoughts on this. My first thought is that, as I've mentioned before, feast or famine, and I know I've been saying that a lot, and I'm sorry, I
No,
apologize,
it's
everyone.
good.
But the industry is kind of in a rough spot right now. So
Okay.
definitely keep that in mind if that's something you're looking to get into. The strikes in 2023 kind of shut down the entire industry, and it really has not properly
Mm.
recovered from that. Like, I think I've seen some statistics that show that the only time that daily shoots were lower in Los Angeles right now, and that's for live action, but the general idea still applies to animation. The
Yeah.
only time that daily shoots were lower in Los Angeles was during the COVID pandemic. So it's kind of rough out there right now. I know a lot of people who were previously working in the industry who aren't right now. And that's not to say you can't do it, but just, be realistic that, especially if you go into this industry, there are going to be times where if you want to work in the industry proper, that is like Disney, Pixar, Nickelodeon, that sort of thing, there are going to be difficult times where there's almost no jobs to speak of. Now, on a note of positivity, it does seem like there's a lot more indie projects popping up. It does seem like there's a lot more faith-based projects popping up. In my own experience, I've worked on two smaller Catholic projects in the years since I stopped working in the Hollywood animation industry. And then, of course, there's stuff like Angel Studios, which always has like a ton of projects going. So even if you don't want to work in the industry proper, or if the industry proper stays kind of dead, so to speak, there are inroads. And I was told when I first started trying to get into animation as, post college, that the people who stick with it are the people who get in. The people who give up when it gets tough are not going to get in. So basically, if it's your dream, keep going for it. Obviously,
Mhm.
realistically, but I there were temptations to give up during those 10 months when I was working at a pizza restaurant. I hated it. I wondered if I was going to have to go back to Denver and be an art teacher. And you just have to keep trying and find a way to make it work, I guess.
I
If you
love
have the
that.
determination, it will work out.
You keep trying and you'll get there. I love that. Yeah, I've had students, I've taught students who have shared like, oh, I want to be an animator. And yeah, didn't know much about the industry, but I think that's a great advice of just like keep trying. That persistence is going to pay off.
Mhm.
I'd love to hear about your journey from going from the animation studios and then into your own company. How did that happen? And yeah.
Oh, okay. So at some level, God kind of made the choice for me. As I mentioned before, there were some strikes in 2023 where the writers and also the actors out here in Hollywood went on strike for a new contract.
Okay.
And I was a storyboard artist, which is the step after writing. So at a certain point, even though I had a gig going on during the strikes, our writers went on strike and there were no more episodes written for the show that I was working on. And if you're step two after writing, you can't really keep working. So we were told at the time by our producers and stuff that we were going to go on a unplanned hiatus, but they swore up, down, and sideways they were bringing us back, they were going to bring everyone back, right? And as time wound on, the strike didn't end, the strike didn't end, the strike didn't end. Then the strike ended and no one heard anything, and no one heard anything, and no one heard
Oh
anything.
no.
And we kept getting emails that were like, we're planning to bring you back, we're planning to bring you back, but we're not going to start until this time, until this time. I myself got two or three sorry, not interviews, emails like that. And then one day we kind of had this group chat of the storyboard artists who were on the show, and some people started getting emailed offers and a lot of people weren't. And we were like, what's going on? And then that Monday, I kind of have a habit of going to the coffee shop on Monday, and I'll like write my novels or whatever, and then I'll walk home.
Love
As
that.
I was walking home, I was praying the joyful mysteries of the rosary with Bishop Robert Barron's reflections. So I was listening to those, and he talks in the mystery of the visitation about how Mary proceeded with joy to Elizabeth because she had found her role in the theodrama rather than the ego drama. She had found her God-given mission. And
Mm,
as I was listening to this, I said a prayer to God that he would show me where he wanted me to be, even if it hurt. Because at this point, it had been, I don't know, like 4 or 5 months since the strikes, since everything kind of imploded. And literally not an hour later, I get a call from the producers saying that they decided to save budget, that they were going to cut half the crew, and I'm part of the half. So that was rough. Um, for
oh,
a couple of like it, people tell you when you're working that your work is so good and they love you so much, and then you end up being part of the crew that they cut, and you kind of wonder, did they really mean it?
mm,
um, but thanks be to God, I have a lovely, wonderful husband, and he works in the video game industry, which is
oh,
much more stable in my experience than the animation industry. I never worked at a company for more than a year. My husband just passed 9 years at Insomniac. So, like,
oh,
thankfully, he had a consistent job. I wasn't like dead in the water. And, another thing about working on that particular show was that there were a lot of things about it that didn't super align with my values, but I kind of had always felt that as long as I wasn't told to storyboard a scene that directly addressed those certain things that didn't align with my values, I wasn't, morally culpable for that or whatever. Still, it never really sat right in my heart. And so when I got cut, my husband was very encouraging. He was like, "You didn't need that show anyway. You didn't even like the messages it was telling, and now you have a chance to do something you really care about. You can write your novels, you can do your personal projects."
Mm.
Um, and so I kind of found myself at this point where I didn't have a job and the industry was very low in jobs. And I just decided to kind of throw myself back into traditional artwork, which I hadn't really done in a very long time because, most animation industry stuff is done on computers now. Even, you're still drawing with a pen, but I hadn't drawn on paper in a long time. And I started doing more watercolor painting, and I had a lot of friends and family mentioning, like, I would buy that, put that on a greeting card or whatever. And so I started to create prints, and little by little, I started to sell at church events or street events. And I will admit that it's not like a booming business. I'm not like running this household. I'm not the breadwinner or anything. But I will say that praise be to God, we've never been in the red on my business. I always make up back at least what I put into it, and I think we're like $300 in the black on that. So that's kind of the story. I gotta say, the show me where you want me to be, even if it hurts, and then getting cut from the show like an hour later was a very direct answer to my prayer, and probably not what I was actually hoping for. But 3 years down the line, I'm actually grateful that it happened. So
That's beautiful. I think that's a very brave prayer as well. Like, show me, even if it hurts. Because, yeah, sometimes God's plans, they can hurt a little bit. I think there's like a C.S. Lewis quote that says, like, I'm not worried about whether or not God has a plan. I'm just worried about how much it's going to hurt. And I like that quote because it's human. Where you're like, no, I know there's going to be a really good plan. I'm just not sure how it's going to impact me in this moment. Um,
yeah,
it's raw.
yeah, no, I like that quote too.
Um, how did you, so this is kind of where I found you is like Catholic Creative or Catholic Creative Connectives, I think.
I think it's Catholic Artist Connection.
Catholic Artist Connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you were a featured artist there, and then I was looking at your watercolor art on Instagram and stuff, and I love those pieces. So it's fun being able to see those, and I was curious kind of how that transition went from animation back into, like you're saying, paper art. How did you rekindle that? Was it hard? And then do you have any advice for any creatives who might be trying to get more into that tangible art again?
Yeah, of course. So it's sort of a funny story. I mean, beyond the fact of losing my job and stuff, but shortly after that had happened, I was briefly in Denver where my family lives, and a lot of my high school and elementary school friends still live in Denver. And so me and my husband went to get lunch with my high school best friend, and we went to this Asian supermarket, and they had these rows and rows of like pottery and teacups and stuff like that. And there was this little teacup that was shaped like an owl, and I love owls. I think they're adorable, and I wanted it so bad, but I was like, I don't really drink tea. Like, can I justify buying this? But it's only $5. And my friend was like, well, you can just use it as your painting cup. And I hadn't painted in a really long time, but I was like, oh, yes, I will do that. It's my excuse to buy the owl cup. So I bought it. And then I felt like since I bought it because I said I was going to use it for painting, I kind of had to paint. And I had previously, a couple weeks earlier than that, seen this really pretty rose with raindrops on it outside of St. Finbar, where my husband and I go to church, and I had taken a photo of it. So when I got home, I decided to paint the rose with the raindrops on it, and it was actually really pretty, and I liked it very much. And then shortly after that, my former spiritual director was being moved to a different diocese. And so I painted a picture of Sacred Heart of Jesus for him as a going away gift. And that also turned out really well. And I was like, wow, this is only the second watercolor painting I've done since coming back. And I feel like it's my best watercolor painting. And I just started to
Wow.
really enjoy it. And then, as I've shared with you over email, and I apologize if I get choked up at all here, but my husband and I were trying to get pregnant, and unfortunately, our first child, Jude, we lost him at 7 weeks in August of 2024. And during that time, um, anyone who has experienced a profound grief or the loss of a child will understand that sometimes you don't have the words. You don't even know what to say to God at that point. And so, kind of, my lifeline was that I felt like prayer was a way to, or sorry, painting was a way to express my emotions, to pray, to kind of make sense of it all without having to use words. And
Hmm.
so a lot of my artwork came from that time after losing baby Jude. Um, and I've just never quit since then.
Wow. It's crazy to me how suffering, like sometimes I just feel like the most intense suffering leads to just incredibly beautiful art. And I've seen this so many times, and it's something that I almost feel like I don't fully understand, even though I've seen this so many times, but I think it's so powerful to me that something so horrifically painful can turn out this beautiful, beautiful art. So um yeah, it's something that I've seen, and but just it's almost like a mystery, I think, to me, just how that works. But um so your pieces are very personal then, and I feel whenever I look at them, there's a lot of emotion in the brush strokes, and I was kind of curious if you have stories about how they've impacted others as well, because I'm sure there's a lot of people who are able to resonate and with those pieces and are touched by them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned, a lot of my pieces of art are, inspired by the loss of baby Jude in 2024. And unfortunately, me and my husband just lost our second baby, Pia, just last month in February. And so there's more grief art coming down the pike, but
Mm.
in a way, I kind of view that as keeping them alive,
Mm.
as my way to mother them, even though they're not here for me to mother them. And through that, through kind of picking my way through the really difficult pain of, losing a child you never got to hold, I have become involved in this group called Redbird Ministries, which is a Catholic child loss support group. They actually don't have a physical presence out here in California, unfortunately, but they do have an app. And on that app, there's just a space to share if you've lost a child at any age, to talk about, the things that frustrate you, about how people react, to share your experiences. And I started posting my grief art in there. And what I found was that a lot of times when I would share the artwork, there would be other mothers or fathers or whoever who would say, like, wow, this was exactly what I needed to see today. This makes me
Mm.
feel seen. It makes me feel not alone. Um, it makes me feel like someone else understands. And in those moments, I often say I don't understand what God is doing. It's really hard to have lost two babies back to back. But those moments where, like, other people are able to be consoled by my artwork, it almost makes sense.
Yeah.
Someone in the app actually told me that by creating this artwork, Jude's mission lives on in your paintings, and I like to think about that. Um, And then like a more direct, less generalized story of how my art has impacted others. At one point, as I mentioned, I sometimes will table at church events like parish picnics or sales or whatever. And at one point, my husband and I were doing actually our first sale ever because he's my table buddy. He comes and helps me sell stuff. Um, and we were set up at this church called St. Vitus. And right after their morning mass, everyone was kind of like flooding out. And I had a display board with all my different paintings there and their prices listed because we were selling prints. And there's a particular painting that I made that I would say was is one of two of my favorite paintings I've ever made. It's called Every Wound for You, and it's a painting of Jesus as he was crucified, with all the wounds and blood and bruises. And it was sort of a riff on the Pieta where the Blessed Virgin Mary is holding Jesus's limp body, but instead it's Jesus bruised and wounded and bloodied, and he's holding me as I'm crying about losing baby Jude. And as these people were filing out of mass, this woman stops cold, like right in front of our booth. And she is looking at Every Wound for You. And she starts crying. And I ask her if she's okay. And she says, I'm not going to tell you why this painting is making me cry or what this painting means to me because I'm going to break down. And I said to her, that's okay. I'll tell you why I painted it. And I told her about losing baby Jude and about how um, I had been listening to this Father Mike talk where he talked about letting ourselves behold and be held by Jesus. And that meant like seeing Jesus in his most destroyed and distraught state and understanding that he did that for you. And so I told her this whole story about how this painting came to me when I was just like ugly crying. I was praying. I know, you know what? It was a prayer. It was like the most honest prayer I've probably ever had. I had a painting of the Sacred Heart in my living room. I was like ugly crying in front of it. And all I could think was, God, this is all I've got. And that's where the image of Every Wound for You came to me. And so I told her this whole story, and she started bawling. And she told me that she had years ago had this debilitating seizure. And for months, she was like absolutely unable to move. She had people taking care of her. And the only way she got through of it was imagining that image of wounded, bloodied Jesus holding her in her tears. And that has always stuck with me. Um, it was a very, very profound moment, and a moment where, this was the first time I had ever sold at an event, and I was really nervous. And I was like, husband, I'm sorry if we don't make any money. And he looked at me after she left and he said, if we don't sell anything this entire day, it was worth it for that. So
Wow. Oh my gosh.
that was really beautiful.
That's incredible. I want to say, yeah, just sorry for your loss. I know with emailing, I've been keeping you in my prayers, because yeah, it's big. But then also I just want to say thank you because I think there's something about suffering, like even this woman's experience where I I feel like suffering is really isolating, where there's so many times where you just like it's like almost like a wall that it's almost impossible for other people to break through because that grief is so real and present and around you. It's like people, it's hard to welcome people into that, even if you want to, like how do you bring them in that moment of intense grief? And I think it's one thing that really strikes me about your art is that it can do that. Like that woman is saying, like this is the image I would, that comforted me. And I think that that's something really powerful about art, where it's like in many ways, it's hard to be with people in a certain way when they're grieving, but that art can be there with them in a unique way, and obviously it's important to still have community, but having that art is like almost a form of, um, community and support and consolation. So that's just something that came to me while you were talking. I was like, this is why we need art. This is so powerful. Um, Shifting gears a little bit, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the link between empathy and then art and or stories. And this is kind of inspired by I was looking at your about page and I saw the read between the lines paper that you wrote, and I was so excited. I was like, we could chat a whole episode on that, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on empathy and then art and stories.
Yeah, of course. So that was a paper I wrote while I was still in college at LMU. I was a philosophy minor. The philosophy department really wanted to steal me from animation, but I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do with a philosophy degree. So I minored to satisfy the professors who kept trying to steal me. But that was for, I think, my modern philosophy course. And essentially, the idea of it was that in a lot of more stringent, I can't think of the word right now, but a lot of the more stringent areas of psychology, there is an argument that you can't feel empathy for a fictional character because feeling empathy is relegated to actually experiencing the emotions of another living thing. And so my paper was based on phenomenology, which is a branch of psychology which observes like the personal experience rather than from a more readily observable lens. And particularly, I was drawing from the writings of Saint Edith Stein
Woohoo!
because she was a phenomenologist. And essentially, my argument was that through the lens of phenomenology that she um, argued, we experience empathy in the same way for real people as we do for fictional characters. And therefore, if we are looking at it through the lens of phenomenology, I think that you can experience true empathy for a fictional character in the same way. I think I drew this comparison in my paper that if you were watching the news and you heard some story about a murder victim, I don't think that's any different than, well, I mean, yes, there's a difference because that's a real person, but like in terms of what's going on in you emotionally, you've never met this person, you've never met this fictional character. And so at some level, that ability to sort of distantly experience their emotions is the same for someone you hear about over the news versus someone you hear about in fiction. And I actually think, and I believe I also argued this in my paper, that to learn to be empathetic for fictional characters who maybe live in a way that you haven't or experience things that you haven't, even
Yes.
if it's like crazy fiction, because I write like fantasy and sci-fi and stuff, but even then you can still, meet the kernels of someone who's lived differently than you have. um, and I think that through meeting fictional characters who have lived differently than you have, who have had traumas you haven't, you can learn to be more open to different types of people through that without having to have the direct experience of meeting those people in real life. Because let's be honest, sometimes you won't meet people like that. And sometimes it's good if you do to kind of have a little baseline level from having read about something similar to that. So I guess that's my general take. Forgive me if it's a little bit uh, top level because it has been, I think, 8 or 9 years since I wrote that paper, but I think I
That was
got the
great.
gist.
That was great. And I love that. I teach literature and there have been so many times where I feel like students, yeah, not only find themselves in books, but then they also find people that they wouldn't normally get along with, but now they're getting like the backstory of these people and they're learning, I think that learning that empathy, exactly what you're talking about. So I love that take. And I also, I haven't read a lot of Edith Stein, but everything I've read of her so far, just like articles I've loved. So I was very excited. And I need to learn more about phenomenology because it sounds fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about your book, Periodically Heroic? Because I found that on Amazon, I think, and that looks amazing.
Yeah, of course. So that was sort of a fun project that I started during that period of time I mentioned where I was kind of in between college and getting my first animation gig. You know how when you're on the internet, you see, I think the best example is probably like BuzzFeed, where it's like, this artist turned cakes into humans and it's amazing, or something like that, or this is like the Disney animals as humans and it's amazing.
Yes.
So at that time, I was kind of thinking about like what's a project I could do like that I could see an article getting written about, because I was kind of trying to get noticed by a studio or something. And so I started working on it during that period of time. Then I got my first job and I found that even in spite of having the job, I just thought it was a cool project. I wanted to finish it. Oh, I guess I didn't mention my idea was to take the periodic table of the elements and give each element a cartoon character based on their primary uses or their namesake or their place of origin, essentially. And I thought that then I would write descriptions based on what had inspired me to make each element look the way that they did. And it would be kind of a fun tool for children or even adults who really like art and cartoons to learn more about the periodic table of the elements. And part of that was also because I'm an art girl, I'm an English girl. I wasn't bad at science, but I hated it. And so I thought, what would make it easier for someone like me to learn about this subject? So that was what it was. I had done a big chunk of it leading up to my first job. Then I kind of fell off of it. And then a couple of years later, when COVID hit, it took a while for the studio I was working at the time to work out the kinks of remote work, which meant I had a lot of downtime. And I was like, everyone got their COVID hobbies, right? My COVID hobby, I guess, was restarting periodically heroic. And I actually went back and I think the first 20 or so elements, I had done them so long ago that I decided to redraw them. Basically the
Wow.
same character designs, but like in a more cleaned up art style. And yeah, I really just spent a huge amount of time during COVID finishing periodically heroic. And then thankfully, my older brother, one of his friends from college, was a chemist. So I was like, hey, can you send this to Justin and have him read my descriptions of the elements and make sure I'm not, you know, saying anything that isn't true? Because to be honest, I did my research on Wikipedia. So like I needed to make sure I did not just make something up from Wikipedia nonsense. Thankfully, he read it, and for the most part, he was like, yeah, this is good. And there were a few things where he was like, the wording could be better so that you aren't accidentally making them think this. But at the core, he was like, this is good. So he's listed as an editor, Justin Hoffman. But yeah, it was kind of my first published book, I guess, because I have a dream of finishing this trilogy of sci-fi fantasy novels I started in high school, but this is kind of the only project that I've like finished, and so I self-published it on Amazon, and I'm pretty proud to say I believe it has sold 76 copies, which is not a ton, but for a self-published book, that's pretty good. So,
Yes, that's fantastic. Can we get a little sneak peek of the trilogy? That I'm so fascinated by this sci-fi fantasy trilogy. Um,
yeah, sure. So, I started writing it when I was 13. So, no one will ever see the first draft because it's so bad. Like, imagine a 13-year-old writing a novel. I did finish it. It was like 300 pages, but
Good.
oh my gosh, it was awful. But essentially, oh man, I'm gonna reveal myself here. I don't have the elevator pitch down yet, but it is a story that takes place in a dystopian future with kind of a dictatorial government, which you would expect to be the main villain of the story, but actually they're not. The main villain of the story is this group of evil wizards called the Acolytes. And to get to why that is the case, it has to do with like a previous conflict between the president of the evil government and the leader of the Acolytes. And so the main character is part of a middle group called the Deserters, who are wizards who broke off from the Acolytes when they stopped. They kind of ended up getting too extreme. And so it's like a three-way war between the Deserters, the Acolytes, and the Master community. And the main sort of contrivance of this story, the reason I started writing it, is because I used to be a big fan of Dragon Ball Z. But I hated how every time a character died, they got brought back to life because I loved Vegeta as a character, but his story would have been so much better if after his final sacrifice, he had just stayed dead. So I started writing this story because the concept of it is that in order for the main character to defeat the main villain, three of his closest friends have to die. That's just part of the rules of the magic of the story. And it was sort of inspired by an anger towards the idea that every character gets brought back to life all the time.
Gosh.
Not an
Oh my
elevator
gosh.
pitch. I'm sorry. It's a little bit of a complicated story, but that's the
Yes.
general idea of it.
Yes. Okay. I love that. I think you need one of those mugs that writers get that just has like the tears of my readers on it that they can like drink from. Because
Yes.
I mean,
No,
character deaths.
I'm so one of those writers. I'm like, oh, character, I love you, and that means you're gonna suffer.
So it's so real.
Oh,
Um, but it sounds very
it's
fascinating.
character development.
It is. And if nothing bad ever happened to them, like where would the story be? I think there's a lot of times where that's partly why we want to write the story is we're like, okay, this is compelling. It's terrible, like it's terribly sad, but it's also compelling.
Yeah,
So if
exactly.
it's a trilogy, yeah, now I'm like, it sounds great. I almost feel like I'm curious. I don't need to know the answer, but I'm curious if it's gonna be like one character dies off each book, or if we're gonna get hit with everyone at the end. Like, I don't know. But
Mhm.
do you have any like ETA for when that coming out soon? Is it work in
So
progress still?
I'm not sure about that because so as I mentioned, I wrote it when I was 13. Then in college, I went, holy crap, this is so poorly written. What were you thinking, 13-year-old Rachel? And I rewrote it. Um, and I thought, this is the best I'm ever gonna write. Rachel, college Rachel, you're awesome. The story is done, at least for the first book. But then a couple of years ago, I read it again and I was like, oh my gosh, college Rachel, you thought this was the best you were ever gonna write? Oh no. And so I started rewriting it again. So I'm currently on my third rewrite of the first book, but famous last words, but I have hope this is going to be the final major rewrite and everything else will be like fixing it. Um, Also, I promise my books don't have as much like in them as I say in my speech. um, my hope would be to finish writing the first book, the third draft of the first book, sometime this year. Um, I am not sure if I'm going to try and get it traditionally published or if I'm going to self-publish it yet. Um, I guess my dream would be to traditionally publish it, but I know that that's a very difficult thing, so we'll see what happens. I'm trying to write a chapter every 2 weeks, which I was doing at a very good clip before I had my first miscarriage, and then everything imploded, and now I'm just getting back into it. But yeah, hopefully, sometime in the next 3 years, the first book will be out in the ether. I don't know.
Oh, that makes me so excited. So I've had a fantasy novel I've been working on since I was 16, and such a similar journey of being like, this is amazing, and then getting a little bit older, looking at it again and being like, this needs to be revised. And then it felt so done to me, and so I sent it off to different agents and stuff, got feedback, and I was like, wait, this isn't done. So I like reworked the whole thing, and I'm in a similar boat of like, I think it's almost done and almost ready to query again, but like I also thought that a couple years ago. So just letting it be what
Yeah.
it's gonna be, letting it unfold.
Yeah, I also don't know if you've had this experience, but for me, when people read it when I was 13 or so, they were
Mhm.
like, Thomas is kind of bland. He doesn't really have a personality. He's my main character. And I was like, you're wrong. You just don't understand. And then my second rewrite, like 6 years later, was actually me going, oh, yeah, Thomas is bland. I do need to rewrite. And then the other critique that I got a lot from a friend was, and I won't go into too much detail on this because it's going to be a spoiler, but she thought that my villain was he was too one dimensional for his backstory. And
Okay.
I was like, you just don't get it. You don't get it. And then just like a couple years ago, I was like, maybe it would help if I made Hephaestus have a bit of a more like nuanced personality. And then that kind of like snowballed into changing a bunch of other stuff about the story that has made it, in my opinion, a lot better. So I've got this one friend who's like, "See, you should have listened to me when you were 13 years old," and I'm like, "Shut up."
It's like
So critiques are often helpful, but I take a while to take them.
oh yeah, I've it's so real. I've gotten beta feedback that's been like, I've got this question and I can't wait to hear more about this. And I was like, actually, I have no idea what the answer is. So like, I'm gonna go rewrite whole chunks of their backstory so that that can inform how I write this story. Where it's like super helpful, but at the time you're just kind of like, why do you have to have questions? Why do
Yeah.
you? Yeah, but I'd love to hear what is your writing process like?
So I will admit I'm not one of those people who has like a big long outline and sort of slides the pieces in there. I again started this story as a 13-year-old, so I was just like and then. And so for me, a lot of the rewriting has been taking the old version, looking at it, going, okay, I like the bones of this, but what doesn't make sense? Um, oh man, I was going to give an example, but I don't want to spoil the first two chapters. I will say that there was something that happened in the first couple chapters of my story that even when I wrote it as a 13-year-old, I was like, why didn't that guy do this? Like he could have
Mhm.
just done this and he would have solved his problem, but it couldn't happen for the way that the story needed to go, if that makes any sense. And so a
Mhm.
lot of the beginning of the rewrite was going, okay, 13-year-old Rachel was like, this has to happen, but it didn't make any sense. So now I have to figure out how to make it make sense.
Yes.
Um, and then I think that also a lot of it is just I really enjoy sitting down with anyone who has any opinions about storytelling and saying, hey, here's my problem. So and so needs to do X, but to do X, he would have to do Y. How do I make that work with his personality and just kind of workshopping it?
Mm.
Um, my friend who had her advice that I didn't listen to is usually my go-to person for that. So I'm better at listening to her advice now. But yeah, for me it's been a lot of like tearing stuff out and going, this is the good piece. And now how do we put actual well-written story around the good piece?
Yes. Oh, that's so fun though. I love was it the pantser versus plotter? Like I love the pantser style. I admire plotters, but the pantser uh like writing process is fun because like you're saying, like you're like, this happens, then that happens. It's a very exciting way of writing. Um
Yeah.
it does make
Yeah.
the editing process, a lot of ripping things apart and rearranging things. But I think there's something really fun about that.
Yeah, I agree.
I wanted to wrap up with one final question of what is your favorite piece of creative advice or one piece of creative advice that you would leave for listeners?
So I thought about this a little bit, and I kind of have the same piece of advice, but put in two different ways. Um, and I guess what I would say is do it anyway. Do it anyway, because one day, and this is going to be funny where this came from, I was on Instagram and someone just posted this video of this guy with this really thick accent singing this song about I do it anyway. I do it when I'm glad. I do it when I'm mad. I do it when I'm sad. I do it when I'm tired. And I was having a really bad day that day and I was on Instagram and I didn't want to do anything. Usually the first thing I do in the morning is I go and I unload our drying rack. And then I saw this video and I was like, I'm going to do it anyway. And I went and unloaded the drying rack and started to feel better. So I kind of use do it anyway for life. But also, I think that a lot of creatives have this fear that this is my baby project. This is the thing I've wanted to do since I was 10. And what if it's not good? What if
Mhm.
it's bad? What if I can't measure up to the vision I have in my head? And it's like, okay, but what if you never do it because you're afraid? Do it
Mhm.
anyways. And when I said I have it two different ways, I believe it's a G.K. Chesterton quote. I could be wrong. Um, Anything worth doing is worth doing badly. So I think those kind of meld together in the do it anyways uh,
Yes.
mindset.
That is so solid. Awesome. All right, everyone. Do it anyway. Thank you so much, Rachel, for coming on and for like sharing your story, sharing your process, and sharing everything. It's been so much fun having you on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a great time and I'm glad we could finally sit down to do this.